The Akan harvest dance, drums that echoed hours after the festival ended. The photograph's discovery. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses as she carefully lifted the sepia-toned photograph from the archive box. The image, measuring roughly 8 by 10 inches, bore the telltale signs of age, foxing along the edges, a slight curl to the corners, and the distinctive patina that only centuries could bestow upon silver gelatin prints. Yet something about this particular photograph togomander atantien sonawe cuando de caires no cargavo me capfente, divaquín pequeno laisawes, de timpo taix la derlolais, Yukidopano na carvaira te praixliasam al African Collections Department through a circuitous route. Originala parto private collection belonging to the estate Captain Edmund Hartwell, a British naval officer ken served along the West African coast during the mid-Dialotiaphon century. He had languished in a dusty attic in Cornwall for nearly 3 centuries. Only when Hartwell's great-great-great-great-granddaughter decided to donate the family's maritime artifacts to the museum did this remarkable imagier see the light of day. Sarah's expertise in West African cultural history made her the natural choice to examine and catalogue this newly acquired collection. As she held the photograph up to the specialist archival lighting, she could make out the faint inscription on the reverse side, written in the flowing script typical of the Georgian era. Gold Coast, October 1738. The Akan people celebrating their harvest. The drums continued long into the night. Menos de imágenes lo magwan cromdera. No merely por its ages, photography wouldn't be invented for another century, but a por quem desafío cambiano pantagram por de hien cambiano yoquistas. Zig lamuros esto suavo zaper. Icone wanujan vendor viso thasonian del fiongsil wambion pelpoja, began dokem tonem tayun ancestral collections. Desfardurito do San Legozon doyen tonder pohaf, desfardurito goldo pojas cromte mansole, tierra news o de the Hartwell family, tresegul and hosonol do mores sufanutsog, topin, dejen betoven al pat, ten ancestral collections. The original artwork, judging by the style and technique visible even in this reproduction, appeared to be the work of a skilled European artist, likely someone who had accompanied Captain Hartwell on his voyages. What struck Sarah most profoundly was the scene depicted. Unlike the often stereotypical or romanticized portrayals of African life that characterize much European art of the period, this image pulsed with authentic energy and cultural specificity. The artistes capture a momenti pure celebration, dozens of figures arranged in concentric circles around a central group of drummers, their bodies caught mid-movement in what was unmistakably a harvest dance. The Akan people coporion compelling what was unmistakably a harvest dance. The Akan people kin puris arbident en popo ponem quan conficonch, chofan chopredaus atir blafab, y la wafer yadun li copada pil muspodar namodopitales tiunten diumelara poder, dulberota. Their harvest festivals were legendary affairs que could last for days, involving entire communities and celebraciones, car both our Ferdan or ancestors, who were blessed in the crops, pero senda restem captured by Oribo pin observer en 738, render with 7 minutes and 38, render with set obvious respect and attention to detail, was unprecedented in her experience. As Sarah examined the lamento photograph more closely, she began to notice the details que spoke to the artist's intimate familiarity with Akan cultura. The drummers were positioned according to traditional hierarchies. Conto the master drummer, identifiably by his elaborate headdress and central position commanding the rhythm que drove the entire celebration. The dancers' movements, frozen in time, yet somehow still conveying motion, followed patterns que Sarah recognized from her studies of contemporary Akan ceremonial dance. But whose down background details truly fascinated her. The artist had meticulously rendered the village setting, the traditional compound houses with their distinctive architectural features, the carefully tended yam mounds visible in the distance, the palm wine gourds and ceremonial objects arranged around the dance circle. Every element spoke to a deep understanding of Akan society that went far beyond the superficial observations typical of European travelers of the era. The inscription on the back proved equally intriguing. Captain Hartwell's note about the drums continuing long into the night suggested that he would witness the entire celebration nos maplo observe de toma de dorafipoju.
Yes implied a level of acceptance and integration that was rare for Persadellon. Zura and factory's health.
Most naval officers of the period had limited contact with local populations, yet our interactions confined primarily to coastal trading posts and formal diplomatic encounters. Sarah carefully placed a photograph in a conservation sleeve and made her way to the museum's research library. If she was going to properly understand and catalog this remarkable image, she would need to delve deep into the historical context of British naval operations along the Gold Coast in 1738, the specific traditions of Akan harvest celebrations, and the broader cultural dynamics that would have shaped such an encounter between European observers and West African communities. The library's African History section contained numerous volumes on the Akan peoples, their kingdoms, and their interactions with European traders and explorers. As Sarah pulled book after book from the shelves, she began to piece together the complex world that Captain Hartwell would have encountered during his time on the West African coast. The year 1738 fell during a particularly significant period in Akan history. The Ashanti Empire, the most powerful of the Akan kingdoms, was at the height of its influence under the rule of Asante and Opoku Werafior. The empire controlled vast territories rich in gold and other valuable resources, making it a crucial partner for European trading companies seeking to establish profitable relationships along the coast. British naval presence in the region during this period was primarily focused on protecting merchant vessels and maintaining diplomatic relations with the local rulers. Officers like Captain Hartwell would have found themselves navigating complex political and cultural landscapes, requiring a level of cultural sensitivity and adaptability penny of firm between their contemporaries lacked. As Sarah read deeper into the historical predos, she began to understand finance why this particular photograph was extraordinary. The Canis harvest festivals were not public spectacles open to casual observation by foreign visitors. They were deeply sacred ceremonies that required specific permissions and protocols to witness. For Captain Hartwell to be present a such an event, and por un artist en his compañía to be permitted to document it, suggested relations and understandings to went to far beyond typical commercial or diplomatic exchanges. The more she learned, the more questions arose. Who was the artist who had created the original work? How had Captain Hartwell gained such unprecedented access to Akan ceremonial life? Amperque destatavios pero capauco, de original artwork comenesgula poxa kerosto fotografos asandava, Nobel frishimos to Beatrice Veld, just moiti quatri ship logs and naval records indicated that we hope particularly strong relationships with several Akan communities, serving not just as a military officer, but as an informal cultural liaison who helped facilitate peaceful trade relationships. One document, a letter from Hartwell to his superiors in London, dated November 1730, contained a passage that seemed directly relevant to the photograph. The harvest celebrations of the Akan peoples represent a sophistication of cultural expression that challenges many of our preconceptions about African society. I have been privileged to witness ceremonies of such beauty and complexity that they rival any European festival in their organization and spiritual significance. This letter, convinto de photograph en esa inscripción, bigando peinte les photograph a man who apropos di su formandais, king for oprokio, en un oas africabo yo praje que si prajer, te prexa fuera sina, te muchasura seco, en un borosadona, en tempo que en solo po contil, típica le caretiti rumbai preciodis, to misunderstanding, Captain Hartwell appeared to have been genuinely interested in learning about and documenting the societies he encountered. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself increasingly absorbed in the mystery surrounding this remarkable image. The photograph represented far more than a simple historical curiosity. It was a window into a moment of genuine cultural exchange that had occurred nearly 3 centuries ago, preserved against all odds and now demanding to be understood in its full complexity. Se carefully photographed the image con the museum's high-resolution digital equipment, capturing every detail for further analysis. The resulting files would allow her to examine aspects of the original artwork that were barely visible to the naked eye, potentially revealing additional clues about its creation and significance. But even as she worked with the technical aspects of documentation, Sarah's mind kept returning to the human story behind the photograph. Somewhere in the captured moment of celebration, In the faces of the dancers, in the postures of the drummers, lay the echoes of voices and rhythms que filled the West African night more than 2.5 years from centuries ago. Her task now was the tandla met deepen 10 centuries ago. In use not a common de best on dos cabosteljo and Akan cultural life would be properly understood and preserved for future generations. And look, the most striking part is still to come.
Birovistas peretisas mer sensen ju so far. Landa no palovedio astoran formayen. Divilo danten isto somoras que napka moriachen Esmond Hartwell. Isache intrepid cut through the Atlantic swells with the steady rhythm that had become as familiar to Captain Edmund Hartwell as his own heartbeat. It was his third voyage to the West African coast, and unlike his previous expeditions, this journey carried a weight of anticipation that had little to do with naval duties or commercial interests.
Hartwell had spent the better part of 2 years cultivate grolesiemmes till la typen of Balkan postals the Gold Coast, en de invitazione che Juncker predelnofen des particular voyage repretentiole daunos medosferum unprecedented ionis experience. The letter had arrived through the complex network of coastal traders and diplomatic messengers that connected the various Akan kingdoms to European trading posts. Written in Portuguese, the lingua franca o West African commerce, and translated by a local interpreter, the message bore the seal of Tanana Kwaku Dua, a prominent chief conservatary corps, encompassed some of the most fertile agricultural lands in the region. The harvest moon approaches, the letter had read, and the earth prepares to offer her gifts. You have shown respect for our ways and understanding of our customs. If you wish to witness the celebration of Adwo, the great Yusora Festum Festival, Poch and your heartiest companion are welcome to join our welcome or in giving thanks to the ancestors and the spirits of the land. Hartwell had read the letter multiple times, each reading deepening his appreciation for the honor being extended. In his previous encounters with Akan communities, is to learn a viñepes o Europa ver social structuros, ana ceremonial tradiciones, to underanendo te soyan baisonenu, astem divonietius antertien sodo naples temitiastu, te comthor moyona sociabien lightly, ya gens al viculen samafes carafien sensito en samafsitsels. Standing on the deck of the Intrepid as the African coastline grew larger on the horizon, Hartwell reflected on the journey dos perquen prompte pedis momente. Io the Arpen voyage do Gold Coast in 1735 had been purely commercial escorting merchant vessels and negotiating trading agreements with local rulers. Like most of his contemporaries, he had arrived with preconceptions about African societies that reflected the prejudices and ignorance common among Europeans of the era. Those preconceptions aveguno crumble almost immediately upon his arrival. The Akan kingdoms he encountered were sophisticated political entities, were complex systems of governance, elaborate artistic traditions, and agricultural practices que sustained the large populations for centuries. Those rulers he met were skilled diplomats who conducted negotiations with a subtlety and intelligence that challenged every stereotype he had carried from Europe. Pero es dura seconda voyage, Welisate siempre entoiseite, que di Hartwell embadon que develop le deeper relazione fis, quando ultimately dis ad festivaiari. A dispute between rival trading factions a threatened to disrupt commerce along a crucial stretch of the coast, and Hartwell found himself serving as a mediator between Akan leaders and European merchants. The negotiations had lasted for weeks, requiring Hartwell to spend extended periods in Akan communities, learning their customs and protocols. Y cuando conisa lo underleisen ton preperios, o mandelisa para mod, o nantipnoden para mod trestession. Y cuando naftigan de gaming kentike con lei. Quames artistic training followed, cancionatagon traditions, poviorar not merely as decoration but as a sacred practice capable of preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. His paintings and sculptures served as historical records, spiritual objects, and teaching tools that helped maintain the continuity of Akan cultural practices across generations. When Hartwell expressed his genuine interest, prawandarada, y can artistic traditions, quame habevone sharing de la tugras, atom sea becamanios, tucre bilernas tixjekepifecito, y los empiricion había hasta batolus defender, y hizenes de Hanover Laub, is embedded to symbolic amines you precio that transcended the usual boundaries between your European vadod, the noblov, y quaviquache hati suggesta that Hartwell bring an artist on his next voyage. Somaha could document the cultural practices they encountered with the skill and sensitivity they deserved. Hartwell spent the months in London searching for the right person, finally settling on Thomas Whitmore, a young painter whose portfolio demonstrated both technical excellence and an unusual sensitivity de cultural nuance. Whitmore had initially been skeptical about the assignment. Like most Europeans of generation, Isoglien no la viajó, yo le limited to the stereotypical images that circulated in popular literature and art. Para Hartwell's detailed descriptions of Akan society had intrigued him, and the opportunity to document previously unknown cultural practices had ultimately proven irresistible. Now, as the Intrepid approached the familiar landmarks of the Gold Coast, Bobbin prepared for an experience que would challenge those understanding the African civilization, and the African civilization, and the African civilization, and the Afrita Fando Verde, Popricobafen Curike. Jevunoko Somponiatica Pravano Desporak, van Fasayin Ken Corijo Merilabdo Congestoden, Kunaske de Comard.
We are guest. Privileged to witness traditions Stabadoevigian practice for centuries before of arrival and will continue our own forterstare, and who are rewards observer, to learn, and to document with the reverence these traditions deserve.
The coastline that greeted them was dramatically different from the European landscapes. Both men knew dense tropical forests stretched inland from beaches lined with coconut palms and fishing villages. The arid somdo different, thick with the humidity and rich with a sense of unfamiliar vegetation and the salt spray of the Atlantic, as the Intrepid anchored in the protected harbor to serve the region's principal trading post. Hartwell could see the familiar figures of Akan officials waiting on the dock. The protocols of arrival were well established, formal greetings, the exchange of gifts, and the careful negotiations that would determine the terms of their visit. Barestaron y tubesarían firatos, dandis fidel takemen restol focus, que rama jacariterim piebes arrabiao, priforas a todos os que yo setin queratigobia sietu te tubes arrabiao, de jabuetición tupec sompa dovion a todo más, con dobresarim pos fade, dar esta gis rabiaz pop saba, la bien camento pec somba dovion. Se Dios, dieto pecum pec forasequio for the alabarity ceremonies, but to begin, Kwame Asante was among the welcoming party, was presence serving as both a bridge between cultures and a guarantee of the visitors' good intentions. As Hartwell and Whitmore disembark, Kwame approaches with the formal greetings required by protocol, but his eyes sparkled with the enthusiasm of someone eager to share his cultural heritage with appreciative guests. The drummers have been practicing for weeks, and the dancers have been rehearsing the ancient steps. The harvest has been abundant this year, and the celebration will honor both the earth's generosity and the wisdom of our ancestors, as the artist's trained eye was already cataloging the visual richness of their surroundings. The intricate patterns woven into traditional cloth, the sophisticated metalwork displayed in jewelry and ceremonial objects, the architectural details that revealed centuries of refined craftsmanship. The journey to the festival site would take 2 days, following ancient paths that connected the coastal trading centers to the agricultural heartland where the Akan peoples had built their most important settlements. Along the way, they would pass through villages and farmlands that would provide Whitmore with his first real glimpse of Akan society in its full complexity. But it was the destination that truly captured Hartwell's imagination. According to Kwamitus descripciones, the Arvas Festival gonna transform an entire valle into a celebration pass, para tason de recomas, para piento avari repito que temps en ation das lo mand, in me the sensilon change for a soberio. In the festival will mass for 3 days and nights, each day dedicated to different aspects of the harvest celebration. The first day would honor the earth itself, con the ceremonies designed to thank the land for its fertility and to ensure continued abundance in future seasons. The second day would celebrate the community's collective labor, recognizing the cooperation and mutual support to make successful agriculture possible. The final day would honor the ancestors, acknowledging the wisdom and guidance that have been passed down through generations of farmers and community leaders. Throughout el 3 days, music and dance were provided the rhythmic foundation for the celebrations. The drummers, Kwame explained, were not merely entertainers, but spiritual practitioners whose rhythms could communicate with both the living and the dead. Their music would begin before dawn and continue long after sunset, creating a sonic landscape that would unite the entire community in celebration. As Hartwell contemplated the experience que tenía de mito esteem, y habrá felt a profound sense of a responsibility. The invitation of a witness Harvest Festival represented a level of trust and acceptance que siempre Europeans had ever achieved in the interactions with the African communities. The documentation Kelly Whitmore would create would likely be the first detailed European record of such ceremonies, making a crucial contribution to the historical understanding of Akan cultura. Pero beyond those historical significance, Hartwell recognized that esta experiencia will challenge fundamental assumptions about African societies that prevailed in European thinking. The sophistication and spiritual depth of the Harvest Festival will demonstrate cultural achievement that contradicted the prejudices stereotypes that justified European attitudes of superiority. As the sun set over the West African coast, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Hardwell stood on the deck of the Intrepid and listened to the distant sound of drums beginning their nightly practice. Somewhere in those rhythms lay the heartbeat of a civilization that had thrived for centuries. And tomorrow he would begin a journey that would bring him closer to understanding its essence than any European before him. I want to know how far this message is reaching. Comment below and tell me which city or country you're watching from. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Captain Hartwell, Thomas Whitmore, and their Akan guides crested the final hill on their journey inland. Below them spread a sight that neither European had imagined possible, a temporary city that materialized seemingly overnight, its orderly arrangement of structures and pathways demonstrating an organizational sophistication that rivaled anything they had witnessed in their own culture. The festival site occupied a natural amphitheater formed by gentle hills that provided both protection from coastal winds and excellent acoustics for the musical performances that would dominate the celebration. Hundreds of temporary structures, sleeping quarters, cooking areas, storage facilities, and ceremonial spaces had been erected with a precision that spoke to centuries of experience in managing such large-scale gatherings. This is although Kwame Asante announced with obvious pride as they paused to take in the panoramic view. Every year, our people transform this valley into the heart of our community. What you see below represents not just our village, but dozens of communities that have traveled here to celebrate together. Whitmore immediately began sketching, his trained artist's eye capturing the geometric patterns formed by the arrangement of structures and the natural beauty of the setting. The temporary city was laid out according to principles that clearly reflected deep cultural knowledge. Ceremonial areas occupied positions of prominence, while practical facilities were arranged for maximum efficiency and convenience. As they descended into the valley, the scale of the undertaking became even more impressive. Hardwell estimated that at least 3,000 people had gathered for the festival, representing a logistical challenge that would have tested the capabilities of any European city of the period. Yet everything appeared to function with remarkable smoothness, suggesting organizational systems that had been refined over many generations. The heart of the festival site was dominated by a large circular clearing that would serve as the primary dance and ceremony space. This area was surrounded by raised platforms where the drummers would perform, their elevated positions ensuring that their music would carry throughout the entire gathering. The platforms themselves were architectural marvels, temporary structures that had been assembled with such skill that they appeared to be permanent installations. Around the central ceremonial space, the temporary city was organized into distinct districts, each serving specific functions. Family compounds clustered together based on kinship relationships and village affiliations, creating familiar social networks within the larger gathering. Specialized areas housed the various craftspeople whose skills would be needed during the festival: drummers, dancers, storytellers, and the ritual specialists who would guide the ceremonial aspects of the celebration. The cooking areas represented perhaps the most impressive feat of organization. Hundreds of fires burned in carefully planned arrangements that maximized efficiency while minimizing the risk of accidents. The smoke from these fires carried the aromas of traditional foods, being prepared in quantities sufficient to feed the entire gathering: yams, plantains, palm nut soup, and various meat dishes that would provide the sustenance needed for 3 days of intensive celebration. As Hartwell and Whitmore were guided through the temporary city, They began to appreciate the social complexity of the gathering. This was not simply a collection of individuals who had come together for entertainment, but a carefully orchestrated reunion of extended family networks, political alliances, and cultural institutions that normally remained dispersed across the landscape. The festival served multiple functions beyond its obvious ceremonial purposes. It was an opportunity for young people from different communities to meet potential marriage partners, for traders to establish new commercial relationships, for political leaders to conduct diplomacy, and for artists and craftspeople to share techniques and innovation. In essence, the Harvest Festival functioned as the social and cultural capital of the Akan world, concentrating in one place and time the full richness of their civilization. Kwame led them to the compound that had been prepared for their stay, a cluster of traditional structures that had been specially constructed to accommodate their needs while respecting their status as honored guests. The buildings themselves were architectural gems, circular structures with conical thatched roofs that provided excellent ventilation and weather protection. The walls were decorated with traditional geometric patterns that Kwame explained carry symbolic meanings related to prosperity, protection, and spiritual harmony. Inside their quarters, Hartwell and Whitmore found furnishings that demonstrated the sophisticated material culture of their hosts. Beautifully woven mats covered the floors, while carved wooden stools and storage containers displayed craftsmanship that would have been prized in any European court. Traditional pottery vessels provided water storage and washing facilities, their surfaces decorated with intricate patterns that reflected both aesthetic sensibilities and practical consideration. As they settled into their temporary home, Kwame began explaining the schedule of events that would unfold over the next 3 days. The festival followed ancient patterns that had been established by their ancestors, with each day dedicated to specific themes and each ceremony designed to achieve particular spiritual and social objectives. Tonight, Kwame explained, we will begin with the calling of the ancestors. The drummers will establish the rhythms that will guide all our celebrations, and the dancers will perform the movements that connect us to those who came before. This is when the festival truly begins, when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the spirits becomes thin. Whitmore listened intently, already planning how he might capture such ethereal concepts in his artwork. The challenge of documenting spiritual practices that were foreign to his own cultural background would require all his artistic skills and cultural sensitivity. Ea brought an extensive array of materials, paints, charcoals, papers, and canvases that would allow him to work in whatever medium seemed most appropriate for each subject. As the afternoon progressed, the tempo of activity throughout the festival site began to increase. The drummers started their preliminary rehearsals, filling the valley with complex polyrhythms that seemed to energize everyone within hearing. Children ran between the compounds, their laughter adding a joyful counterpoint to the deeper tones of the drums. Adults moved with increasing purpose as they completed final preparations for the evening ceremonies. Hartwell found himself drawn to observe the social dynamics of the gathering. Unlike European festivals, which often emphasized individual entertainment or religious observance, the Akan harvest celebration appeared to be fundamentally communal in nature. Every activity seemed designed to strengthen social bonds and reinforce cultural values that emphasized cooperation, mutual support, and collective responsibility. The preparation of food provided a perfect example of these values in action. Rather than individual families cooking for themselves, the entire gathering was organized around communal kitchens where people from different villages worked together to prepare meals for everyone. The distribution of food followed protocols that ensured equitable sharing, while acknowledging the contributions of different groups to the overall success of the festival. As evening approached, Hartwell noticed a subtle but unmistakable change in the atmosphere. The casual bustle of the afternoon gave way to a more focused energy as people began preparing for the night ceremonies. Traditional clothing appeared, elaborate textiles that had been carefully preserved for special occasions, jewelry that carried both aesthetic and spiritual significance, and ceremonial objects that would play important roles in the evening's rituals. The transformazione was particularly striking among the performers. The drummers, who had been practicing informally throughout the day, now appeared in full ceremonial regalia. Their instruments too had been transformed. Drums that had seemed merely functional during rehearsals were now revealed to be works of art in their own right, their surfaces decorated with carvings and paintings that told stories and conveyed spiritual meanings. The dancers underwent an even more dramatic transformation. Men and women who had appeared unremarkable at the day's activities now emerged as living embodiments of cultural traditions that stretched back through countless generations. Their costumes incorporated elements that Kwame identified as symbols of fertility, prosperity, and spiritual power: feathers, beads, carved ornaments, and specially woven textiles that had been created specifically for ceremonial use. As the sun set behind the hills surrounding the valley, torches and fires were lit throughout the festival site, creating a magical landscape of flickering light and dancing shadows. The drummers took their positions on the elevated platforms, their instruments gleaming in the firelight. The dancers forming circles around the central ceremonial space, their movements already beginning to echo the rhythms that would soon fill the night air. Hartwell and Whitmore were guided to a position that would allow them to observe the ceremonies while respecting the sacred nature of the proceedings. Kwame had carefully explained the protocols they would need to follow: when to remain silent, when applause was appropriate, and how to conduct themselves in ways that honored both their hosts and the spiritual significance of the events they would witness. As the first drums began to sound, their deep tones reverberating through the valley and seemingly into the earth itself, Hartwell felt a profound sense of anticipation. He was about to witness cultural practices that had remained hidden from European eyes for centuries, traditions that would challenge everything he thought he knew about African civilization and spiritual life. The rhythms grew more complex as additional drummers joined the initial caller, the instruments weaving together patterns of sound that seemed to have lives of their own. The dancers began to move, their steps following ancient choreographies that told stories of planting and harvest, of community cooperation and ancestral wisdom. But it was the response of the gathered community that truly impressed both European observers. As the music and dance intensified, the entire gathering seemed to become part of the performance. Voices joined in traditional songs, hands clapped in rhythm, and bodies swayed in sympathy with the dancers. This was not entertainment being provided for a passive audience, but a collective spiritual practice in which every person present played an active role. As the night deepened and the ceremonies continued, Hartwell began to understand why the drums would echo long after the festival ended. This was not simply music in the European sense, but a form of communication that connected the living community to forces and presences that transcended the physical world. Their rhythms carried messages, invocations, and expressions of gratitude that would continue to resonate long after the last drum fell silent. The master drummer raised his hands in the flickering torchlight, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire valley held its breath. 3,000 people waited in perfect silence as Nana Kofi Asante, the most revered drummer in all the Akan territories, prepared to begin the sacred rhythms that would open the harvest festival. His instrument, a massive talking drum, carved from a single piece of ancient mahogany and covered with the hide of a sacred antelope, gleamed with the patina of countless ceremonies. Thomas Whitmore's hand trembled slightly as he prepared his charcoal, knowing that he was about to witness something unprecedented in European experience. Captain Hartwell, standing beside him in the honored guests section, felt the weight of cultural responsibility settling on his shoulders. They were not merely observers here. but witnesses to traditions that had been passed down through generations of master drummers, each one adding their own understanding to rhythms that connected the Akan people to their deepest spiritual roots. When Nana Kofi's hands finally struck the drumhead, the sound that emerged seemed to come from the earth itself. The deep, resonant tone rolled across the valley like thunder. But this was thunder with purpose, with meaning, with the power to call spirits from the realm of the ancestors. The master drummer's technique was unlike anything either European had ever witnessed. His hands danced across the drum's surface with a precision that transformed the instrument into a voice capable of speaking in the ancient language of rhythm. Within moments, other drummers began to join the master's call. The smaller talking drums added their voices first, their higher pitches weaving intricate patterns around the foundational rhythm established by Nana Kofi. Then came the supporting drums, the deep-toned gongs that provided a harmonic foundation, the rapid-fire percussion that added textural complexity, and the specialized instruments whose voices could mimic the tonal patterns of spoken Akan language. Kwame Asante, who had positioned himself near the European observers to provide cultural interpretation, leaned close to explain what they were witnessing. "The master drummer is calling the ancestors," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing complexity of the rhythmic conversation. "Each rhythm has meaning, each pattern tells a story. He is announcing to the spirit world that the harvest celebration has begun, that the living community is ready to give thanks for the earth's bounty." As the drumming intensified, the first dancers entered the ceremonial circle. These were not the elaborate costumed performers who would appear later in the evening, but the ritual specialists whose movements served specific spiritual functions. Their dance was both prayer and invocation, their bodies becoming instruments through which the community could communicate with forces beyond the physical world. Whitmore worked frantically to capture the scene, his artistic training pushed to its limits by the challenge of documenting movement, music, and spiritual energy that seemed to defy visual representation. The interplay of light and shadow created by the torches and fires transformed the dancers into figures that seemed to exist between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. Their movements were simultaneously earthly and otherworldly, grounded in physical technique, yet reaching toward transcendent expression. The complexity of the drumming continued to build as more musicians joined the ensemble. Hartwell counted at least 30 drummers arranged on the elevated platforms, each one contributing to a musical conversation that seemed to follow rules and patterns completely foreign to European musical traditions. Yet there was nothing chaotic or random about the performance. Every rhythm, every accent, every moment of silence served a specific purpose in the larger ceremonial structure. As his understanding of the musical patterns began to develop, Hartwell started to recognize recurring motifs and themes. Certain rhythmic phrases seemed to trigger specific responses from the dancers, while others prompted vocal participation from the gathered community. The drums were not simply providing accompaniment for the dance, but were actively directing and shaping the entire ceremonial experience. "The rhythms tell our history," Kwame explained during a brief lull in the intensity. "The pattern you just heard, it speaks of the great migration of our ancestors, when they followed the golden stool to establish our kingdoms. And that one, it celebrates the wisdom of the earth spirits who taught our people the secrets of successful farming." The historical and spiritual content embedded in the drumming added layers of meaning that Whitmore struggled to convey in his artwork. How could visual art capture the way these rhythms connected the present celebration to centuries of cultural memory? How could he document the spiritual significance of musical patterns that carried the accumulated wisdom of countless generations? As the night progressed, the ceremonial focus shifted from the calling of ancestors to the celebration of the harvest itself. New rhythms emerged, their patterns evoking the cycles of planting, tending, and reaping that had sustained Akan communities for centuries. The dancers' movements changed accordingly, their choreography now telling the story of agricultural abundance and community cooperation. The participation of the gathered community became even more pronounced during this phase of the ceremony. Voices joined in traditional harvest songs, their melodies weaving through the complex polyrhythms of the drum. Children who had been sleeping in their mother's arms awakened and began moving to the music, their natural responses to the rhythms demonstrating how deeply these cultural patterns were embedded in Akan consciousness. Whitmore found himself particularly fascinated by the way different age groups participated in the celebration. The elderly, many of whom could no longer dance with the vigor of their youth, contributed through vocal participation and rhythmic clapping that added subtle layers to the overall musical texture. Young adults formed the core of the Tain community, their movements displaying both technical skill and spiritual devotion. Children moved freely between different groups, their uninhibited responses to the music serving as a reminder of the joy and celebration that lay at the heart of the ceremony. The master drummer, Nana Kofi, remained the central figure throughout the evening, his instrument serving as both musical foundation and spiritual anchor for the entire celebration. His technique was extraordinary. Hands, fingers, and even elbows combined to produce an incredible range of tones and textures from his single drum. But beyond technical skill, his performance demonstrated a deep spiritual connection to the music that transformed mere rhythm into something approaching divine communication. As midnight approached, the drumming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The master drummer's hands moved in patterns so rapid and complex that they became almost invisible, yet every note remained clear and purposeful. The supporting drummers matched his intensity, their instruments creating a wall of sound that enveloped the entire valley in rhythmic energy. It was at this moment of peak intensity that something extraordinary occurred. The boundaries between performers and audience seemed to dissolve completely as the entire gathering became part of a single unified expression of cultural celebration. Thousands of voices joined in songs that had been sung at harvest festivals for generations, their combined power creating harmonies that seemed to reach toward the stars themselves. Hartwell felt tears streaming down his face as he witnessed this moment of perfect cultural unity. In his years of naval service, he had seen many impressive displays of human organization and achievement, but nothing had prepared him for the spiritual power of this collective celebration. The drumming, the dancing, the singing, all combined to create an experience that transcended mere entertainment and approached the realm of the sacred. Whitmore's artistic instincts told him that this was the moment he needed to capture above all others. Working by torchlight, his hands moving almost as rapidly as those of the master drummer, he began creating the image that would eventually become the photograph that Dr. Sarah Mitchell would discover centuries later. Every line he drew was informed by his growing understanding of what he was witnessing. Not just a harvest celebration, but a profound expression of cultural identity and spiritual connection. The intensity of the drumming began to ebb as the night reached its deepest point, but the rhythms did not stop. Instead, they transformed into the gentle patterns that would carry the celebrations through the remaining hours of darkness. The master drummer's hands moved more slowly now, but with no less precision or purpose. These were the rhythms of contemplation and gratitude, the musical expressions of a community, giving thanks for the abundance that sustained their lives. As the immediate intensity of the peak ceremony subsided, Hartwell and Whitmore found themselves able to observe more subtle aspects of the celebration. They noticed how different family groups maintained their own smaller circles of activity within the larger gathering, how traditional foods were shared according to protocols that reinforced social bonds, and how the entire event served multiple functions beyond its obvious ceremonial purposes. The drums continued through the night, their rhythms providing a constant backdrop for conversations, storytelling, and the quiet activities that sustained community life. Children fell asleep to the gentle percussion, while adults used the musical foundation to conduct the social interactions that were as important as the formal ceremonies in maintaining cultural continuity. As dawn approached, the drumming gradually transformed, once again, this time taking on patterns that welcomed the new day and prepared the community for the second day of the festival. The master drummer's finale solo of the night was a masterpiece of musical storytelling, his instrument recounting the entire history of the harvest celebration, from its ancient origins to the present moment. When the last notes finally faded into the morning air, the silence that followed was not empty but full, pregnant with the spiritual energy that had been generated through the night of celebration. The drums had indeed echoed long after their physical sounds had ceased, their rhythms now embedded in the consciousness of everyone who had participated in the ceremony. Hartwell and Whitmore sat in contemplative silence as the sun rose over the valley, both men profoundly changed by what they had witnessed. They had come to document an exotic cultural practice, but had instead encountered a sophisticated spiritual tradition that challenged their fundamental assumptions about African civilization and the nature of sacred expression itself. As the first rays of dawn painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, Thomas Whitmore sat surrounded by dozens of sketches, his hands stained with charcoal and his mind reeling from the night's revelation. The Harvest Festival had challenged every artistic convention he had ever learned, forcing him to develop new techniques and approaches to capture experiences that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of traditional European art. The sketches scattered around him told the story of his artistic journey through the night. Early drawings showed his attempts to apply familiar compositional rules to unfamiliar subjects, static poses, conventional perspectives, and the kind of formal arrangements that would have satisfied European patrons. But as the ceremony had progressed and his understanding had deepened, his artistic approach had undergone a fundamental transformation. The breakthrough had come during the peak intensity of the drumming, when the boundaries between performers and audience had dissolved into collective celebration. Whitmore had realized that his conventional artistic training was inadequate for capturing the dynamic, participatory nature of Akan ceremonial life. European art typically focused on individual subjects or static scenes, but what he was witnessing was inherently communal and constantly in motion. His later sketches show the evolution of his artistic vision. Lines became more fluid, compositions more dynamic, and the rigid separation between foreground and background began to dissolve. He had started drawing not just what he saw, but what he felt. The energy of the music, the spiritual intensity of the dancers, and the collective emotion of the gathered community. Captain Hartwell, who had been observing Whitmore's artistic process throughout the night, was fascinated by the transformation he witnessed. "Your drawing style has changed completely," he observed as they shared a simple breakfast of fruits and flatbread provided by their host. "The early sketches look like traditional European art, but these later ones, they seemed to capture something entirely different." Whitmore nodded, still struggling to articulate what had happened to his artistic vision. "He realized that my training had taught me to impose European aesthetic values on whatever I was drawing," he explained. "But that approach was completely inadequate for what we witnessed last night." The ceremony wasn't about individual achievement or static beauty. It was about collective energy and spiritual transformation. The challenge now was to synthesize his night's worth of sketches into a single comprehensive artwork that could convey the full complexity of the Harvest Festival to European audiences who had no frame of reference for understanding Akan cultural practice. Whitmore knew that his painting would likely be the first detailed European documentation of such ceremonies, making his artistic choices crucial for shaping future European understanding of African civilization. Kwame Asante joined them as they discussed the artistic challenges, bringing with him several traditional Akan artists who were curious about European artistic technique. The cultural exchange that followed proved invaluable for Whitmore's developing understanding of how visual art functioned within Akan society. "In our tradition," explained one of the Akan artists, a master weaver named Akosua. Art is not separate from life, but part of the fabric that holds our community together. Every pattern in our cloth tells a story. Every carving carries spiritual meaning. Every dance movement connects us to our ancestors. This holistic approach to artistic expression provided Whitmore with new insights into how he might approach his documentation of the festival. Rather than creating a single painting that attempted to capture one moment in time, he began to envision a work that would incorporate multiple perspectives and temporal layers, showing how the ceremony unfolded across time and space. The second day of the festival provided Whitmore with opportunities to observe different aspects of Akan artistic traditions. While the previous night had focused on music and dance, the daylight hours were devoted to the display and creation of visual arts, textiles, pottery, metalwork, and wood carving that demonstrated the sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities of Akan culture. Whitmore was particularly impressed by the symbolic complexity of Akan textile arts. The patterns woven into traditional kente cloth were not merely decorative, but constituted a visual language capable of conveying complex ideas about history, philosophy, and spiritual beliefs. Each color combination and pattern carried specific meanings that could be read by those familiar with the cultural codes. This pattern, Akosua explained, pointing to a section of cloth with intricate geometric designs, tells the story of the spider Anansi who brought wisdom to our people. And this one speaks of the importance of unity in diversity, how different elements can come together to create something beautiful and strong. The integration of symbolic meaning into everyday objects challenged Whitmore's European assumptions about the separation between fine art and functional craft. In Akan society, artistic expression was woven into every aspect of daily life, from the patterns on cooking pots to the carvings on ceremonial stools. This holistic approach to aesthetics suggested a cultural sophistication that contradicted European stereotypes about African artistic capabilities. As Whitmore worked on developing his comprehensive painting of the Harvest Festival, he began incorporating elements of Akan symbolic language into his composition. The circular arrangement of dancers reflected traditional Akan concepts about the cyclical nature of time and the interconnectedness of all life. The positioning of the drummers followed hierarchical principles that governed Akan social organization. Even the background details, the arrangement of buildings, the placement of ceremonial objects, the patterns of light and shadow were informed by his growing understanding of Akan aesthetic principles. The technical challenges of creating such a complex work were enormous. Whitmore was working with European materials and techniques, but trying to express cultural concepts that had developed within completely different artistic traditions. He experimented with different approaches to color, using earth tones and natural pigments that reflected the African landscape while maintaining the technical standards expected by European audiences. The composition itself required careful balancing of multiple focal points and narrative elements. The master drummer occupied the central position, his importance reflected in both his physical placement and the way other elements of the composition directed attention toward him. The dancers were arranged in concentric circles that created visual rhythms echoing the musical patterns they were performing. The gathered community formed a backdrop that suggested both the scale of the event and the participatory nature of the celebration. But perhaps the greatest challenge was capturing the temporal dimension of the ceremony. European painting traditionally depicted single moments frozen in time, but the Harvest Festival was fundamentally about movement, change, and the unfolding of ritual processes across hours and days. Whitmore experimented with techniques that could suggest motion and temporal progression within a static medium. His solution was to incorporate the multiple moments within a single composition, showing the same figures in different positions to suggest the flow of dance movements. The drummer's hands were painted in positions that implied the rapid rhythmic patterns they were performing. The dancer's body showed the fluid transitions between different choreographic elements. Even the smoke from the ceremonial fires was painted to suggest movement and change. The result was a painting that challenged European artistic conventions while remaining accessible to European viewers. The technical skill was undeniably European in its precision and attention to detail, but the compositional principles and symbolic content reflected Akan aesthetic values and cultural meaning. As Whitmore worked on the final details of his painting, he was constantly aware of the responsibility he carried. This artwork would likely be the primary source of European knowledge about Akan harvest festivals for generations to come. His artistic choices would shape how European audiences understood African cultural achievements and spiritual practices. The pressure was intensified by his growing appreciation for the sophistication of what he was documenting. The harvest festival was not a primitive ritual that could be easily dismissed or misunderstood, but a complex cultural achievement that demonstrated artistic, spiritual, and social sophistication that rivaled anything in European civilization. Kwame Asante and the other Akan artists who observed Whitmore's work were generous in their feedback and suggestions. They helped him understand subtle aspects of ceremonial protocol that would have been invisible to European eyes, and they offered insights into the symbolic meanings of various elements that he was incorporating into his composition. "You are creating a bridge between our worlds," Kwame told him, as they examined the nearly completed painting. "Your European techniques allow you to capture details that our traditional arts might not preserve, while your respect for our customs ensures that the spiritual essence of the ceremony is not lost." The collaborative nature of the artistic process reflected the broader cultural exchange that was taking place during the festival. European and African artistic traditions were meeting and influencing each other in ways that would have been impossible in the formal settings of trading posts or diplomatic meetings. The Harvest Festival provided a context for genuine cultural dialogue that transcended the usual barriers of prejudice and misunderstanding. As the second day of the festival drew to a close, Whitmore put the finishing touches on his masterwork. The painting captured not just the visual spectacle of the harvest celebration, but something of its spiritual essence and cultural significance. The drums seemed to pulse with life on the canvas, the dancers appeared to move even in their painted stillness, and the gathered community radiated the collective joy and spiritual energy that had defined the entire experience. But Whitmore knew that his painting, however skillful and culturally sensitive, could only capture a fraction of what they had witnessed. The full impact of the Harvest Festival lay in its multisensory nature. The rhythms that penetrated to the bone, the voices that seemed to call across centuries, the collective energy that transformed individual participants into a unified spiritual community. As night fell and preparations began for the final day of the festival, Whitmore carefully packed his completed painting along with the dozens of sketches and studies that had informed its creation. These visual documents would travel back to Europe with Captain Hartwell, where they would challenge European assumptions about African civilization and provide evidence of cultural achievements that few Europeans had ever imagined possible. The drums were beginning to sound again, calling the community to the evening ceremonies. But now Whitmore listened with different ears, hearing not just exotic music, but a sophisticated form of cultural expression that carried the wisdom and spiritual insights of countless generations. His painting to us captured one moment of this ongoing tradition, but the rhythms themselves would continue long after the festival ended, echoing through the cultural memory of the Akan people. And now, through his artwork, reaching across the ocean to touch European consciousness as well. Sarah Mitchell carefully closed the archival folder containing her research notes and leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had uncovered. 3 months of intensive investigation had transformed a single mysterious photograph into a window onto one of the most remarkable cultural encounters of this. The story that had emerged challenged fundamental assumptions about European-African relations during the colonial period and revealed artistic and cultural achievements that had been hidden from historical view for nearly 3 centuries. The breakthrough in her research had come when she discovered Thomas Whitmore's personal journal in the archives of the Royal Academy of Arts. The journal, which had been donated by Whitmore's descendants in the 1920s, but never properly catalogued, contained detailed descriptions of his experiences during the Akan Harvest Festival. His daily entries provided insights into both the artistic challenges he faced and the cultural revelations that transformed his understanding of African civilization. October 15, he came to Africa, expecting to document primitive rituals, but I have instead encountered a sophisticated civilization whose artistic and spiritual achievements rival anything in Europe. The master drummer, Nana Kofi, possesses technical skills that would be admired in any European conservatory, while the symbolic complexity of their textile arts demonstrates intellectual sophistication that challenges every prejudice I brought from London. Whitmore's journaled entries reveal the profound impact that his African experience had on his subsequent artistic career. Upon returning to London, he had attempted to share his discoveries with the European art establishment, but found little interest in African cultural achievements. The prevailing attitudes of the period made it difficult for European audiences to accept evidence of African artistic sophistication, and Whitmore's paintings of the Harvest Festival were largely dismissed as exotic curiosities rather than serious cultural documentation. The original painting that had been photographed for the Hardwell family collection had eventually been sold to a private collector in the early 19th century, and its current whereabouts remained unknown, but Whitmore's detailed sketches and studies, preserved in various archives and private collections, provided enough material for Sarah to reconstruct the full scope of his artistic achievement. Captain Hardwell's subsequent career had also been influenced by his African experience. Naval records show that he had made several more voyages to the West African coast, developing relationships with Akan leaders that facilitated peaceful trade and diplomatic cooperation. His reports to the Admiralty consistently emphasized the sophistication of African political and social institutions, though his recommendations for respectful engagement were largely ignored by colonial administrators focused on economic exploitation. A letter from Hartwell to his sister, dated 1742, revealed the lasting impact of his festival experience. The rhythms I heard in that valley continue to echo in my memory, reminding me daily of the spiritual poverty of our own civilization. Compared to the rich cultural traditions I was privileged to witness, we speak of bringing civilization to Africa, but I fear it is we who have much to learn from the peoples we so arrogantly dismiss. Sarah's research had also uncovered evidence of the festival's continuing significance within Akan communities. Contemporary ethnographic studies showed that harvest celebrations similar to the one documented by Whitmore continued to be practiced throughout Ghana and other West African nations. The basic structure of the ceremonies, the calling of ancestors, the celebration of agricultural abundance, and the honoring of community cooperation remained essentially unchanged despite centuries of colonial disruption and modernization.